Alright, so continuing with my recaps from the 2023 Rochester Open. Started round 1, won that game. Round 2, I played National Master Matt Jensen from here at ChessGoals. And I had white in this. This is actually my third time, I believe, playing him in over-the-board chess. Previous 2 games were draws, which I was a little upset about because I feel like I definitely had some winning chances, certainly in one of them where I messed up the end game. But there were some chances both ways in those games, and 1 out of 2 is not a bad result at all. But this was the rubber match, I guess, match number 3. So I had white against him, and I played g3, which is what I've been playing a lot recently. And he played e5, which I'm not sure what factored into that, if he'd planned that or what, but I had actually mentioned to him a while back that if you're ever facing g3, my personal recommendation is e5, and there is a reason for that. I think it's the most critical. It sort of forces an English opening out of white, because the only really good move here for white is c4. Now, it doesn't make it a bad move. It's totally fine for white, and in my upcoming 1g3 course, that's exactly what I recommend, of course, against e5. But it's sort of forcing that way, because otherwise black is going to just put two pawns in the center, and white's going to be kind of fighting for equality, which would be very bad after 2 moves. So like if white continues with something like bishop g2, which is for some reason very popular online, black just plays d5, and he's got, like, he's at least equal, in my opinion, 2 moves into the game, so that just kind of refutes the opening. So I continued with c4. He played knight c6, bishop g2, and then he played knight g to e7, and I played knight c3, and he continued g6. And at this point, I'm just kind of playing chess. I do have, like I said, the upcoming g3 course I'm working on, and I do definitely look at these lines. And in these lines, I think I advocate for a d3 and e4 setup. And we'll see if it remains that way before I release the full course or not. There's obviously different ways to approach this position. But I decided that I wanted to go a slightly different way. I thought, for example, that this whole setup, he's probably going to continue with f5, and although I'm still totally fine there with the d3 and e4 setups, I wasn't sure that I was wanting that kind of game against Matt. I thought I just didn't want to give him that kind of play where his f-pawn push was immediately hitting my pawn on e4. So instead, I decided that I was going to continue with e3, and go for this kind of setup with d4. Which may not necessarily objectively be the best, but I was fine with just having an evenish game, maybe slight edge for white still, and I just didn't want to give him f5 with the hit on my e-pawn. That said, f5 is still probably a very good idea for black at some point, maybe not like right here, but after a few moves gets castled, and then continuing with f4. So again, this may not be the most critical setup. I'll spend some time researching it, but of course I haven't really looked at this game. I'm going to do all my recaps kind of live, where I haven't looked at this, and I certainly haven't looked at it with a computer. So some of my analysis could be wrong, but this is what I opted for in the game. He continued bishop g7, knight g to e2, and then he castled. So of course I go ahead and castle. We've kind of finished our initial part of development, so we need to get some pieces out on the queen side though. And then he played d6, which is, I'm sure, a totally fine move, maybe the best move. But if I was black, I was wondering if maybe he continues with f5 first, or maybe like b6. Could be a little iffy opening up the slung diagonal, but maybe if you can get b6 and bishop b7 in. I don't know, I was kind of a little greedy thinking from like what I would do as black and try and get d5 in one move at some point. But that's probably a bit greedy. d6 is very solid. I'm sure it's probably objectively the best move. Alright, so I played d4. And I figured, if he takes, I'll just take and have this this nice kind of small center here. I wasn't really necessarily worried about that. He played bishop g4, and I played h3. I figured if he takes, I can just fall back with this knight to continue defending my d pawn. He goes back with the bishop to d7, so I suppose he just kind of wanted to provoke this and then make a target. But I don't think his queen really belongs on c8, personally, and I kind of briefly mentioned this after the game. It's probably fine, but I just felt like it was a little bit of passive play, and my king is not all that bad on h2. It's not really lost of time since he took, 3 moves to put his bishop and queen on these squares, and I only took 2 moves to put my pawn and king on these squares. And his queen's kind of in the way of his rooks connecting, and I just felt like this was not really all that bad for me. So I was fine to see that. Alright, so after bishop d7, I continued with b3. At any point I could push this pawn, and maybe I should have sooner, rather than continuing to give him the option, but I guess more times than not, I feel like leaving tension is good. And so from a human level, I just felt like leaving the tension, leaving this open, like this, to maybe I'll push, maybe I'll take, maybe I'll just leave it here. And I want to get more pieces in the game, and I felt like my bishop being on one of these 2 squares would be very good. Obviously, you can't do much from d2. Alright, so b3, he continues with queen c8, so of course I play king h2 to defend my pawn. And then he continues knight f5. I thought that was a reasonable move, although we both kind of mentioned after the game that I was expecting f5 at some point. But I do understand the rationale between knight f5. Now, knight f5 does provoke this pawn forward, but that's a move that maybe I should have already played anyway. So I don't know that him provoking me to play a move that I probably should have already played was necessarily good for him. But it's not like I don't think white's winning or anything yet. But I do get some space with tempo, so d5, then he goes back to d8 with his knight. I do wonder if b8 might have been a better move. It's a little hard, his pieces are so cramped, but potentially, maybe there's some more prospects here. Whereas right now, that knight's kind of staring at my pawns, and it literally has no moves. At least for the time being, it just has no moves. And it's, I feel like black is kind of backwards developing a little bit, because, here, the bishop could come out, the queen step up, and then the rooks are connected, right? And a few moves later, black is, like, further away from connecting the rooks, so we're deeper into the game, and the rooks are even further away from being connected, so I feel like that's kind of indicative of black kind of backwards in development. So I was very happy to see that move. The only idea I could really see behind it is c6. Kind of trying to break on this and then maybe get his knight or bishop to this long diagonal. And for that reason, I played bishop a3 here. And the reason for bishop a3 is that if he tries to break with c6, I could kick his knight with one of these pawn moves. I'd have to think about which one's better. Probably e4, but kick this knight with one of these pawn moves, and then this pawn doesn't have a defender, and then I just gobble it for free, and with tempo on his knight, right? So, or on his rook. So I thought bishop a3 was a pretty decent move, because it's prophylactic. It develops my bishop, and it's prophylactic against c6. So you continue with b6, and I went ahead and played queen d2, just to go ahead and kind of finish development, add another defender to my knight, connect my rooks, so on. Played knight b7. It makes sense. I mean, he had to give his knight somewhere, some possibility to get back into the game, so that's, b6 and knight b7 does that. But, the knight still doesn't have a whole lot of good squares. It could come to c5, but I'm just going to take it off with my bishop. I feel like the knights are potentially better than the bishops, with literally all the pawns still on the board. Which was another reason I put my bishop here, is because I figured if his knight ever did come to this square, I would just take it off. And he's moved that knight a bunch of times. I've only moved my bishop twice. And I feel like it's a favorable exchange for me. Alright, so after knight bd7, I played rook a to c1 just to get my rook off of this diagonal. I do wonder if maybe I should have put it on d1 or e1, just because kind of long term I saw this idea of the, like this bishop maybe being annoying. But I don't know. It's still very close at this point, and it's a very reasonable move. So rook a c1. He played h5, and I don't know that that move is the best, but I do understand it. He wanted to kind of prevent g4, though I don't know that I wanted to play g4 right now anyway. But it also allows, like, maybe the maybe the king and then the bishop. I kind of understand the move, but I do think that maybe it also gives me a target later on when I'm ready to play g4 to try and break open. So h5 is a little double-edged in that way. At this point, I went ahead and played e4. So the nice thing about e4 is now that my rook is off of a1, which I should have mentioned this maybe a couple moves ago, I had considered playing e4, in some of these previous moves, but the knight could hop in and possibly be annoying, because if I take it, pawn takes, and my knight doesn't have... It can't go to this square where I would like for it to go to, because the pawn could push, hitting my knight, and the bishop hitting the rook, right? So because of that, I need my rook off of a1 before I play this, if I want my knight to be able to go to this square after taking his knight. And so that was also part of the thought process between rook a to c1. So then after h5, I continued with my plan of playing e4. So that if he comes here, I can just take, and then knight here, and there's no push with the discovery. And I'm, his pawns are doubled and weak, and I'm putting a lot of pressure on that square. And it's not really clear how he would even defend that pawn, because I'm hitting it twice immediately. And trying to defend it with his c-pawn, I could just en passant, right? And then take here. So I feel like knight here just now loses a pawn, whereas before it would actually win material. So that was also the reason for moving the rook. So after rook a c1, h5, e4, he goes back to h6 with his knight. And then f4. So now I'm breaking in the center, and I felt like this made sense because black is still kind of cramped. I've completed development, and the other nice thing is I've pinned this pawn. So he could take, of course, helping me open things up, but if I take, he has to take back with the bishop. He can't take with the pawn, and we'll see that. So f4, he played king h7. King h7 makes sense for a lot of reasons, but I think the main one is the tactical reason that after I take, he has to take with the bishop, and that leaves the knight undefended. So I think king h7 does make a lot of sense, because he can't really move the knight anywhere when the king is still here, and he can't leave it undefended. Otherwise, this pawn just drops unless he has like a defender, which is very passive. So yeah, I think king h7 is kind of obligatory there. All right, so anyway, I played f takes e5, which he expected, of course. Bishop takes. And here I opted for knight f4. I'm not sure what objectively the best move is, but I felt like this knight could get more involved in the game. And what I wanted to do was, in addition to breaking open the center, I wanted to trade off my e-pawn. Because my e-pawn is backward here. So I wanted to get rid of that weakness, open things up so that I can try and attack the black position. And I wanted to go for a nice little reroute, where I go back to d3, hitting this bishop, and then if the bishop moves, I get to push the pawn. So that was kind of my plan, and we do get to see that happen, because black played queen d8. Queen d8, I tried to understand the rationale behind the move. I wasn't entirely sure, to be honest. I mean, the queen's literally just kind of shuffled here. I mean, I do understand that the queen is not ideally placed on c8, which is why I thought it didn't need to go there to begin with. The only thing I could think of was like maybe coming here to g5, but as soon as I move my knight, which I was intending to do anyway, that is no longer possible. So So I wasn't entirely sure. But anyway, I continued with my plan, so after queen d8, I played knight d3. And you know what, actually I realized something. So queen d8 is kind of a genius move. Which he must have missed too. I think this is a blunder. So queen d8 was actually a genius move, and this was a blunder. So I think Matt missed a shot here because of this. Knight g4 check, and if I take the knight, the queen drops in, and this does not look pretty for me. Now he has sacrificed a piece. This is very interesting. Okay, so... How do I evaluate this? So he's sacrificed a piece, maybe it's not enough? I don't know, this is very scary though. I don't feel like I can open things up, so I'm probably just losing this pawn too. I don't know, maybe this is not enough for him because I can take the bishop. What else does he have here? Oh, well, could he... Oh, right. Even better for him. He can just take this pawn with the bishop, and then this is a mate threat. Can I... So I have to move my bishop. I have to move my bishop, right? One of these squares. Probably here. And then... I'm not entirely sure... Does he take here? Or here? Or even maybe with the pawn to try and move, but that seems a little slow. I'm not entirely sure here, but I feel like black has something here. This would take some calculating, and maybe it's like one of those computer lines that humanly it's really hard to work out. Because it does kind of seem like I'm defending, but on the other hand, my king is ripped open pretty badly. And if he does get this pawn, he's not sacrificed that much material. Anyway, that's an interesting idea. That did not happen, but that is a very interesting idea of this knight check, potentially. Okay, so continuing, I played knight d3, and he played bishop g7, so that was what I expected him to play, was just to retreat the bishop. And after bishop g7, I continue with e5. Purpose being that, obviously, like, he can't take, because this rook falls. So that was kind of the whole point of that reroute. So he played knight f5. And then I played rook c to e1. I have to be a little bit careful. There's ideas of this bishop skewering. I might be able to block with the knight, but I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, there's this move. If I don't trade that off first or move or something. I just didn't like the idea of this bishop coming here. So I wanted to just preemptively move the rook out of the way, add a defender to this pawn. I think that's very solid. So bishop h6 was indeed played. And then I played queen f2. The reason I played queen f2 was primarily that if the queen now comes in here, I already have a defender on this square, so I don't have to worry about spinning a move to defend after the fact. Also, if the knight or bishop was to hop in here, so for example, like let's say this queen moves somewhere else, I'm not sure where yet. This knight could be hopping in here, this could be very annoying. But by leaving my queen and rook covering the square together, I could trade the rook for 2 pieces, which would obviously be a very good trade for me. So it kind of helps cover both of these squares. So he plays bishop to e8. I think he was just kind of preemptively offering extra protection to this f pawn. I don't know if it was really necessary, but I do understand it. Bishop e8, so I play bishop e4. I thought this was a solid move. Point is that I am x-raying the king, so x-raying pinning this pawn. Maybe I get some kind of play against his h-pawn. Immediately threatening to trade the bishop for the knight and pawn and just break open his position. So he has to kind of respond to that. So bishop e4, he goes knight e7. And so now you can see that I am actually pinning this pawn, which is why I continue with g4. And I'm actually just threatening to win this pawn here, if he doesn't trade or do something. I thought he would actually take here. I know it's a little scary, and I'm not. It's a little scary for him because I can slide my king over and start bringing rooks to bear down this this h file. But I still think maybe this is his best. But it's definitely scary. So g4, he plays knight to c5. That knight really had no way into the game, so it makes sense to at least make me trade this bishop off for it. But of course I am going to trade the bishop off for it rather than let that knight do anything. And knights are potentially better. Like if they find good squares, they're better in these positions because there's so many pawns still on the board. So bishop takes c5, b takes c5. And then of course I take the h-pawn. So I have just, at least for now, won that pawn. So I'm up a pawn. And then he played d takes e5. And I had to think here for quite a while because I wasn't sure that I wanted to take this pawn. I can take it, and I'm not even necessarily worried about the queen pinning the knight. Not just because I could defend it, but I could just simply move my king back somewhere. Because he can't take the knight, or I would discover check, you know, and then take his queen, right? So the knight would be tactically defended. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to open that diagonal up for his queen, because his queen is so bad right now. On the other hand, what I opted for was taking this pawn. And I don't know, yeah, I'm not sure which is better. Maybe this was not as good. But I thought, okay, if he ever comes here, I'm just going to trade queens. And trading queens I feel like is quite good for me, because I'm up material, and I have better minor pieces. So I felt very, very solid about that, just trying to play against his queen, getting into the game. And I wanted to kind of keep this diagonal to my king blocked. Alternatively, I could have maybe just taken this pawn. Also, Matt kind of mentioned after the game, and I thought about this as well, of just taking this pawn first. So like takes, and then maybe takes, and then here. And that could be better, rather than allowing him to get the f5 pawn push in. But I suppose, whether it was right or not, I just didn't feel like I was worried about him playing f5, because my pieces are so much better. I felt like just any tactics were going to favor me. But yeah, maybe in retrospect I should trade here first, then decide what I want to do. I could still take on c5, still take on e5. But I don't know. I wasn't sure if I wanted to make his rook better like that. But okay, in any case, I took on c5, and then he played f5 right away. So of course at this point, the pawn is no longer pinned, so I do go ahead and take. And he takes back with the bishop. And this is the only square I can go to where I don't just get forked. Or, well, I suppose I could go all the way to h1, but that seemed a little bit less active. So bishop g2, and then he plays e4. And I understand that move, but I do have a nice square on f4, I felt like. So knight f4, hitting this bishop, threatening this fork, kind of blockading the pawns, so they're not really so scary. Which I saw this when I went into this line, so I still don't feel afraid here. Matt did say maybe I shouldn't have played f5 to give him any kind of smidge of counterplay, and he's probably right, but I do also think that my evaluation that I'm still much better here is right. So knight f4, he plays bishop to f7, so I can't take his bishop pair, and I'm not gonna fork him. And I played knight b5. So knight b5 was an interesting idea. I'm hitting this pawn, I'm hitting this pawn. Maybe I can reroute and land two knights here to actually indeed fork him. Yeah, it just seemed like a good move. So knight b5, and he responded with c6, which I do think was a good move. I didn't expect it for some reason. That was dumb of me, but I went ahead and took, and then he brings his queen in. So he gets his queen active, and maybe there are other moves here, but it just felt like the safest move was back to f2. Because I have to defend my knight, because otherwise he might take this with check, right? And I do wonder if maybe he should still take this with checks to avoid the queen trade. But in that case, my queen gets very active, very close to his king. He gives up the bishop pair, and okay, he can get one of these pawns back, but I still feel very safe, and I'm still up a pawn. So he trades queens. I was happy to see that. And then he takes one of the pawns back, so I go back to being up one pawn. I didn't really ever expect to hold that pawn, though of course it would have been nice if I could have somehow snuck c7 and kept it, but even then he could just dislodge my knight. So that pawn was never really going to stay safe. But yeah, so he gets one of the pawns back, but I've traded queens off. I feel very safe. I don't think these pawns are going anywhere. They're blockaded. So yeah, I feel very good right now. Knight takes c6. And then I played knight to knight to d6, and I thought this was a very good move. The purpose being that this bishop really doesn't have a good square. Like, if any of these squares are covered by knights, and if he gives up the bishop pair, he really loses any compensation I feel like he has. But I'm also threatening this f pawn. And so this is just very, very difficult for him. So he plays bishop to g8, and I actually take f5 anyway. So obviously I took a moment to calculate this, and I think he missed this, and maybe there wasn't really much he could do about it to begin with. But I take on f5, and this is kind of the end here, because after rook takes, which is what he played, bishop takes e4. I pin the rook to the king. So material is equal, but obviously at bare minimum, I'm going to get the exchange because I'm pinning his rook, and possibly more, right? So bishop takes e4, rook f8, just adding a defender. Knight g2, a nice move because it adds another attacker immediately, and it threatens to add another attacker with the knight, and prevent the king from getting closer, or fork the king and rook if he does step the king up right away. So knight g2, just a very elegant move. After knight g2, he played knight to d4 to add another defender. Knight to h4, adding another attacker and preventing the king from approaching. Bishop to e6, adding another defender. Rook e to f1. So we're kind of like at a critical mass now. I've got all four of my pieces, everything but my king, and obviously pawns, targeting his rook. And he has 3 defenders, and he has no way to add any more defenders because the king is boxed out by the knight. So after rook e to f1, he plays bishop to e3. Kind of a desperate move. There's nothing he can do here. Hitting the rook, but I actually just ignore it entirely and take the rook, because if he takes my rook, I'm just gonna take the knight with discover check, pick up the bishop as well. I mean, it's just completely over. Knight takes f5, played one more move, rook takes f5, but I just take with the bishop with check, and here he resigned, because he could take with, say, the knight or the bishop or whatever, but I'm going to take, and he's going to take, and I'm going to take, and I'm not only still up the exchange I was guaranteed to get at the very beginning when I pinned his rook, but I have also, I've just picked up all these pawns. I'm up 3 pawns and the exchange. It's just obviously completely over. So anyway, he resigned a couple moves before this, and it was a very good game. I felt like Matt let me get him very, very cramped. And obviously I don't feel like he was losing this early on, but I felt like the whole logical fallacy in Black's play started with this idea of provoking this pawn and queen c8. Because sometimes that's a good approach to try and target that, but I felt like 2 things. Number one, he should have gone for this whole f5 idea, which he never really did until very late in the game. And number 2, it's ignoring kind of a basic principle of finishing development, getting all your pieces active in the game, connecting your rooks, just getting your maximum firepower to bear. And again, like a few moves before this, so like right here, I'm not sure where the best square for the bishop is. Maybe f5, right? Or maybe you just kind of wait on the bishop and play f5 and decide where the bishop's going to go. Or maybe you play b6 and, you know, develop the bishop this way. But just like on paper, he's 2 moves away from connecting the rooks. You know, bishop and queen somewhere. So like bishop f5, queen d7, just as an example. I'm not saying those are the best moves. And then instead, 1, 2, 3 moves later, he is just as far, if not further, because now he can't even go to f5. I could just hit it right away. He can't go here because of the fork, right? So he's actually more than 2 moves, because he's got to find another way to get a square. So at least 3 moves, maybe 4 moves or more, to connecting his rooks, 3 moves later from when he was only 2 moves away. So he's definitely taken like 4 steps back, at least, in development. Maybe that's a little harsh, but I feel like this whole idea was at least a loss of 4 tempi for black. Because this, you could say, okay, I have to play h3, king h2, but those aren't necessarily bad or wasted moves for me. Whereas I felt like these kind of were. And we even saw that later where, you know, the queen moved again right back to the starting square. Bishop even, you know, takes a while, but... Oh, sorry, this is the sideline there. Yeah, not knight g4. Here we go. Takes a while, but then bishop moves again as well, right? Finally gets to life over here on this side of the board. But those 2 pieces had to move a bunch of times, and really black does not connect his pieces, connect his rooks, until move 33 of the game. So again, if we go, maybe I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, but if we go all the way back to move 8, black is objectively as few as 2 moves away from connecting his rooks, and instead he took another 25 moves to do that. And I think that just kind of spells disaster for anyone playing. Other than that, Matt played a very good game. I had to definitely think at some points. Maybe he missed a tactic there, I'm not even entirely sure, but maybe there was a tactic with this knight g4 check, so there could have possibly been a shot here of some kind. So I don't know that it was flawless play, but overall I felt very good with this. I won again, starting the tournament 2-0, so definitely the best start I've had to a tournament, beating 2 masters back to back. And then of course round 3 I took a half-point bye. So what was really awesome was entering round 4 of a 5-round tournament, I was tied for 2nd place and was playing on board 2. Little spoiler alert, I did not finish in 2nd place, but with that many masters in the tournament and the level of competition, I thought that was obviously a very good start. So that'll end this for recap number 2, and then we'll move on to round 4's recap in the next video.